The wine glass hit the floor before I even realized what had happened. Crystal shattered across the mahogany red liquid streaking through papers marked "Classified." The 4-star general I'd been assigned to assist General Marcus Hale, hero of 2 wars, and a man whose reputation could silence a room, was staring at me as if I had just spoken the name of a ghost. He whispered something I almost didn't catch. My mother's name. I stood frozen in his dining room, my hands still gripping the folder I'd brought for briefing. The smell of aged wine, polished wood, and something older memory maybe hung in the air. For a Marine, I've been trained to hold composure under fire. But this wasn't a firefight. This was something deeper, personal, and I had no manual for it. 2 hours earlier, I thought this would be just another assignment. The call came that morning from HQ Quantico Major Claire Dawson. Report to the Pentagon Liaison Office at 0800. You'll be assisting General Marcus Hale for the NATO summit briefings. No explanation, no context, just orders. Everyone in my division knew his name. A man carved out of discipline and legend decorations stretching from Desert Storm to the Middle East campaigns. Rumor had it he hadn't taken a personal leave in 20 years. I remember thinking, great. Another marble statue in uniform. When I arrived at his residence in Arlington, it was like stepping into a museum of control. Everything gleamed: books arranged by subject and decade photographs perfectly aligned, no dust, no warmth. A framed quote above his desk caught my eye. "Duty is the only family that never leaves you." It made me smile bitterly, maybe. My own family didn't last long enough for that kind of poetry. He was reviewing briefing materials when I entered, posture rigid, eyes sharp. "Major Dawson," he said, not looking up. "You'll manage my logistics, liaison communication, and press security for next week's conference. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Dinner at 1900. We'll review privately. Dress code formal." That was it. No small talk, no human tone, just orders. At dinner, the formality didn't break. He poured 2 glasses of wine more out of ritual than warmth. He asked about my record recon tours, intelligence work, languages. When I mentioned my late mother, Evelyn, and her time as a civilian medic overseas, he paused mid-sip. "Evelyn?" he asked, voice lower, unfamiliar. "Yes, sir," I said. "She passed away 12 years ago." Something flickered across his face, a tremor quickly buried. We moved on to policy talk, the quiet hum of a clock marking the seconds between our sentences. I thought the night would end in silence until he loosened his sleeve to reach for a file, and I saw it. A small tattoo just above his wrist, a red rose thorns curling into the shape of an infinity loop. The air left my lungs. My mother had the exact same tattoo, same wrist. She used to hide it beneath her bracelet. I'd asked her once as a kid what it meant. She smiled and said, "It's a promise that never ends." That was all she'd ever say. I stared at his wrist, and before I could stop myself, I blurted, "Sir, my mother has a tattoo just like yours." He froze. His eyes, cold blue steel a moment ago, widened. He dropped the glass. It shattered against the floor. And in the heavy silence that followed, he whispered her name, Evelyn. I didn't speak. Couldn't. My mind spun backward through the years, through the silence of my childhood, the unanswered questions, the way my mother avoided every story that began with, "Before I was born." The general's gaze was fixed somewhere far away, not at me. He looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost walk in wearing a uniform. "I'm sorry," I finally said, kneeling to collect the glass pieces. But he didn't hear me. His lips trembled as he repeated the name Evelyn again, like a prayer he'd forgotten how to finish. I left soon after, unsure whether I'd just uncovered a coincidence or the start of something I was never meant to find. Driving back through Arlington's quiet streets, I couldn't stop shaking. Outside my windshield, the lights of the Pentagon flickered like a constellation I no longer trusted. Inside, every part of me felt unmoored. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at an old photograph of my mother in her nurse's uniform. For the first time, I noticed the edge of a military jeep behind her, its license plate marked NATO 91. And standing in the background, slightly out of focus, was a tall man in dress blues looking directly at the camera. Even in the grainy print, the resemblance was unmistakable. It was him. General Marcus Hale. I didn't sleep that night. Something inside me had shifted, an ache, an anger, a hunger for answers. If he had known my mother, if he had whispered her name like that, then I needed to know why. Because my mother had died believing some promises were never meant to be kept, and I had just found the man who might have broken the one that mattered most. I didn't report the next morning. I just sat in my car parked outside the Pentagon, the sun hitting the windshield, the clock ticking past 0800. I told myself it was because of a late-night migraine. But the truth was simpler. I didn't know how to face him. When I finally walked into his office, the general acted as if nothing had happened. He was already dressed in full uniform ribbons lined up with surgical precision, every motion exact. He didn't mention the wine glass, the name he'd whispered, or the look that had frozen both of us in place. Just Major Dawson update me on the conference schedule. And like a good Marine, I complied. Still, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head, the sound of glass breaking, the way his jaw had gone slack when he said Evelyn. He knew her, not in passing. He knew her in the kind of way that leaves a mark under the skin. That evening I stayed late under the excuse of finishing logistics. The office was quiet, all the aides gone. Through the open door to his study, I saw him sitting by the window holding something small in his hand. A locket. Silver. He opened it, and for a moment his face softened into something I hadn't seen before: grief. I backed away before he noticed, but I couldn't shake the image. When I got home that night, I pulled out the old cedar box I kept in my closet. It smelled like my mother's perfume, lavender, and faint smoke from the wood stove of our house in North Carolina. Inside were the things I never looked at: her nursing pin, a faded photo of her holding me as a baby, a postcard from Italy, and one yellowed letter she'd never sent. The letter was addressed simply M. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Her handwriting curved neat and deliberate, the way she wrote grocery lists and lullabies. Marcus, I can't ask you to choose between duty and love. You already made that choice for both of us. I'll raise our child quietly. She won't carry your name, but I promise she'll carry your strength. I dropped the paper. It fluttered down onto the table like something sacred and fragile. There it was, the truth I'd never asked for, staring back at me in ink and sorrow. My mother had kept her promise. She'd raised me strong, proud, silent. And she'd died without ever telling me who my father was. The next morning I was back at Quantico, standing in the archives section, an old room that smelled of dust and history. The records clerk looked half asleep until I said the words, NATO Relief Mission 1991. He blinked, shuffled papers, and disappeared for 10 minutes. When he returned, he had a slim file in his hand. There she was, Evelyn Grace Dawson, Civilian Medical Support, and right beneath her name, Commanding Officer Colonel Marcus Hale. A photograph clipped to the corner showed a younger version of both of them. He had his arm around her shoulders, both smiling at the camera, standing in front of a field hospital tent. Her wrist was turned slightly outward, just enough to reveal that same small red rose. I stood there staring at the photo until the letters blurred. It was proof, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like betrayal multiplied by decades. That night I drove to my aunt's house, the only person left who might know the truth. She was sitting on her porch, wrapped in a shawl, sipping sweet tea like she always did. When she saw me, she smiled, but it faded quickly. "You found it, didn't you?" she said softly. "Found what?" "The letter, the photo, the past." I didn't have to answer. She sighed, eyes misting. "Your mama was young. She thought love could survive the Marine Corps. But Marcus had ambitions, Senator Wallace's daughter, politics command. Your mother didn't want to ruin his life, so she left before he even knew you existed." My throat tightened. "So he never knew." She shook her head. "Not until now, I reckon." I sat in silence, the night pressing close around us, cicadas humming in the trees. My whole life I'd believed my father was just a blank space, a missing name on a birth certificate. Now that space had a face, a uniform, a voice that said my mother's name like it still hurt to say it. Back at my apartment, I looked again at my reflection in the mirror, same eyes as my mother's, same freckles, but something sterner, colder. I understood now why the general had looked at me that way. He saw the past standing right in front of him. But I wasn't going to let a secret buried 30 years ago define me. If Marcus Hale was my father, then he owed me more than silence. He owed my mother the truth she took to her grave. And he owed me an explanation. I picked up the phone and called his aide. "Tell the general I said that Major Dawson requests a private meeting, off record." There was a pause on the line. "Tomorrow, 0700 hours, his estate in Arlington." "Perfect." When I hung up, I noticed the letter on the table, its words trembling under the lamplight. I traced my mother's signature, Evelyn, and whispered, "I'll get your answer, Mom, even if it kills me." Outside, the wind rattled against the window pane like distant gunfire, and somewhere in that sound I imagined her voice, steady, proud, forgiving. But I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. The general's estate sat at the edge of Arlington's quiet suburbs, a place where discipline seemed to live in the walls. Marble steps, a flag flying, perfectly centered hedges trimmed with military precision. I arrived at 0700. Sharp uniform-pressed boots shined, but beneath the starch and salute my hands were shaking. The butler led me through a corridor of portraits, generals, campaigns, medals gleaming under morning light. Then finally the study. General Marcus Hale stood near the window, dressed in full uniform even at dawn. He didn't turn when I entered. "Close the door, Major," he said. I did. The silence between us felt heavier than any classified file. He finally faced me. His eyes, gray, not blue like winter sky, studied my face with painful recognition. "I see her when I look at you," he said quietly. "Your mother." I swallowed hard. "So you admit it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't know. Not until last night." He looked down, his hand trembling slightly as he poured black coffee into a cup. "Evelyn never told me." I took a step closer. "You were her commanding officer. Yes, you loved her." He exhaled, more than I was allowed to. He told me everything in short, sharp bursts, like a man filing a report on his own guilt. In 1991, during the NATO relief mission, he'd met my mother at a field hospital in Sarajevo. She was young, fearless, with that stubborn streak I knew too well. They worked side by side during an evacuation under mortar fire. He was wounded. She refused to leave him. They stayed together through the mission secretly. But when they returned stateside, the politics of his career caught up with him. He was engaged to Catherine Wallace, daughter of a senator whose influence could secure his next command, a marriage arranged more by ambition than affection. When my mother realized what he was walking into, she walked away first without telling him she was pregnant. He never saw her again. "I looked for her," he said, years later, but she'd changed her name, moved to North Carolina. I thought she wanted to be forgotten. I wanted to shout, to call him a coward, to tell him how his ambition had cost my mother everything. But when I looked at him, the tremor in his hand, the weight behind his eyes, I saw something else. Regret. Real, raw, decades old. "I'm not here for sympathy, sir," I said, voice steady. "I'm here for truth, and for her." He nodded once. "You deserve that." He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver locket. He handed it to me. "She gave this to me before we deployed. I kept it all these years. I didn't even know she had the same one." When I opened it, I nearly dropped it. Inside was a photo of my mother smiling at the camera and a pressed rose petal behind the glass. For a long time I couldn't speak. Then the general said something I didn't expect. "I want to make it right." I looked up, doubtful. "You can't," I said. He met my eyes. "Maybe not, but I can try." He reached for a file on his desk, my transfer orders. "There's a classified mission in Florida. Disaster recovery, civilian evacuation. I've requested you personally. It's not penance, it's trust. You have her spirit, Claire. Lead them the way she would have." His tone was sincere, almost pleading. But I was too raw to hear it as anything other than control. "You don't get to honor her now," I said coldly. "She honored you when you didn't deserve it." I placed the locket on the desk, then saluted, short, formal, and final. "Permission to be dismissed, sir." He didn't answer. He only stood there, eyes lowered like a man saluting a grave no one else could see. I spent that night driving without direction. Past the monuments, past the Pentagon, into the back roads that led toward the Potomac. I rolled down the window, the cold air cutting my face, and I let myself feel the anger I'd buried for years. For once, I didn't want to be Major Dawson, the model Marine. I wanted to be the daughter of Evelyn, the woman who'd loved without fear and been forgotten for it. But when I looked at my reflection in the glass, I saw both of them, her warmth, his discipline. The parts of me that had always warred were now staring each other down. 2 days later, my orders arrived. Deployment Florida Coast, Hurricane Recovery Mission, duration 2 weeks, command under General Marcus Hale. Of course. When I saw his signature at the bottom, I nearly tore the paper in half. But a Marine follows orders, and maybe part of me wanted to see what kind of man my father really was under fire. Before leaving, I stopped by my mother's grave for the first time in months. I brought a single red rose just like the one on her wrist. Kneeling, I whispered, "You were braver than both of us combined." The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of a flag flapping in the distance. I took that as her answer. When I reached the base, the first thing I saw was the general standing on the tarmac surrounded by a cluster of officers. Our eyes met for just a second. He didn't smile. Neither did I. But something passed between us, acknowledgement, unfinished business, maybe even a fragile truce. The rotor blades of the transport helicopter started spinning, wind kicking up dust around us. He raised his hand in a sharp salute. I returned it. Then I climbed aboard. Somewhere inside, beneath the noise and uniforms, I felt it the faintest stirrings of something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. The Florida air hit like a furnace the moment I stepped off the helicopter. Hot, thick, heavy with the smell of salt and diesel. Hurricane Jasper had torn through the coast 2 days earlier, roofs gone, trees ripped out by their roots. Entire neighborhoods, half swallowed by water. Our Marine unit was there to secure supply routes and assist the National Guard with civilian rescue. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. And for me, it was the perfect distraction from the truth I'd just learned that my commanding officer was also my father. The first few days were chaos. Roads flooded, communications, unstable tempers short. I buried myself in logistics, organizing convoys and coordinating airlifts. I didn't see the general much except during briefings. When I did, his tone toward me was strictly professional. No eye contact longer than a second, no personal words. But I could feel it, that quiet tension between us, the unspoken history hanging in every salute. One afternoon after a 14-hour shift, I found myself in the mess tent, too tired to eat. Sergeant Ramos sat down across from me, nodding toward the general's tent outside. "Man's been working 20 hours straight," he said. "Doesn't even sit to eat." "You ever seen someone that wound up?" I gave a dry laugh. "You have no idea." But Ramos wasn't joking. He's pushing himself too hard. You can tell something's eating at him. I looked through the tent flap, saw Hale standing in the distance, sleeves rolled up, barking orders to a junior officer. The setting sun caught the glint of his wristwatch and the edge of that red rose tattoo. For a moment, my throat tightened. 2 days later, a civilian evacuation went sideways. A flash flood hit faster than expected, cutting off a group of rescue trucks. We managed to pull everyone out, but one Marine nearly drowned in the current. The general blamed himself, said he should have called it off sooner. That night, he ordered the command team to meet privately. Inside the operations tent, under the harsh white glow of lanterns, I saw something I'd never seen in him before: exhaustion. He dismissed the others one by one until only I remained. When the flap closed, he turned to me. "Major Dawson," he said quietly, "why didn't you tell me?" I froze. "Tell you what?" He leaned against the table, voice low, not angry but hurt. "That you knew. About Evelyn. About us." I met his eyes. "I wasn't sure you deserved to know." His jaw tightened. "You think I don't live with enough ghosts already?" "Maybe you do," I said. "But my mother lived with silence. That was your choice." He exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between anger and regret. "She left, Claire. She didn't even give me a chance to choose. She left because she knew what your choice would be." My voice cracked. "You would have picked your career, the senator's daughter, the promotion, and you did." He didn't deny it. He just looked at me the same way he must have looked at her all those years ago, with that mixture of pride and regret. "You have every right to hate me," he said. "I don't hate you," I replied quietly. "I just don't know how to respect you anymore." That hit him harder than shouting ever could. The next morning, he sent me on a ground recon with 2 corporals to survey a collapsed bridge. Maybe he wanted distance. Maybe I did too. But halfway through the patrol, the radio cut out, and minutes later, the levee near us gave way. The rush of water came like a freight train. We scrambled for higher ground, but one of the trucks overturned. I managed to pull the driver out, shoulder half torn from debris. By the time the chopper reached us, my uniform was soaked in mud and blood. Back at base, I expected to be scolded for breaking protocol. Instead, the general met me outside the medic tent, eyes wide. He took one look at my arm and his voice dropped an octave. "You're bleeding." "I'm fine," I said. "The corporal's worse." He stared at me for a moment, then turned to the corpsman. "Get her treated now." I wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped me. Not command, concern, real paternal concern. That night, the storm finally broke. The air turned cooler, the camp quiet, except for the hum of generators. I sat by the supply truck, arm bandaged, watching lightning fade over the ocean. He walked up silently, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one without a word. For a long time we just sat there, a Marine major and a 4-star general, pretending to be nothing more. Then softly he said, "You remind me of her." I didn't look at him. "That's not a compliment." "It is," he said. "She was the best part of me." Something in his voice cracked on that last word. I turned, saw the tears he tried to hide behind discipline. He cleared his throat. I thought duty would make me strong, but it just made me alone. The words hung in the air, raw and real. And for the first time I saw him not as a general, but as a man who had paid for his choices every day since. Before he walked away, he said quietly, "You're free to hate me, Claire, but I hope someday you'll see I never stopped loving her or the daughter I never knew I had." I couldn't answer. Not yet. But after he left, I looked down at my wrist, the faint outline of a scar from childhood, and traced it with my finger. A line, a wound, a connection. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was just about acknowledging that pain and love often come from the same place. When I closed my eyes that night, I heard my mother's voice again. "One day the truth will salute you." And somewhere inside, I finally began to understand what she meant. The storm had moved on, but the aftermath looked like war. From the air, Florida's coastline resembled a battlefield, pockets of destruction surrounded by silence, whole towns drowned in brown water. We'd been working 18-hour days, clearing debris, restoring power, escorting FEMA teams through neighborhoods that no longer had names. For me, it wasn't just another mission. It was a battlefield of the soul. Every radio call, every fallen beam, every civilian face, it reminded me of how my mother used to describe Sarajevo. "Chaos teaches you who you are," she'd said once, "and who you still have time to become." I didn't realize it then, but I was starting to become her. We were 3 days into the second phase of recovery when the levee near Milton collapsed without warning. A group of volunteers was trapped on the far side, water rising fast. General Hale was coordinating air support when the line crackled. "Major Dawson, get your unit out of there. That levee's gone." But we couldn't leave yet. 2 trucks were still loaded with civilians, an old couple, a boy no older than 10, and a woman holding a newborn. I keyed the mic. "Negative, sir. We're not clear yet. Give us 5 minutes." The radio hissed. "That's an order, Major." I ignored it. My sergeant gave me a look, half fear, half faith, and we waded into the chest-deep water. Every step was like walking through cement. The baby cried, the boy screamed for his dog, and somewhere behind me a car alarm wailed like a dying thing. When the water surged again, it swept me off my feet. The current slammed me against a guardrail, pain ripping through my shoulder. Someone grabbed me, a strong hand, calloused, and pulled me back. "Got you," Sergeant Ramos shouted. "You're not dying today, ma'am." We made it to higher ground, soaked, shivering, but alive. The chopper arrived minutes later. We loaded the civilians one by one. As the helicopter lifted, the woman with the newborn reached out, tears streaming down her face. "God bless you, Major," she said. "You saved us." Her words echoed in my head long after the blades faded. By the time we returned to base, my shoulder was swollen, my body shaking with exhaustion. But I refused medical attention. Instead, I walked straight to the operations tent, mud still caked on my boots. The general was there, pacing in front of the maps. When he saw me, he stopped cold. "Are you insane?" he snapped. "You disobeyed a direct order." I saluted sharply. "Sir, those people would have drowned." He slammed his hand on the table. "And so would you. You think heroics make you immortal? You think he stopped mid-sentence, breathing hard. His face softened. Claire. I already lost your mother to a mission like that. I couldn't. He didn't finish. For the first time I saw him not as my superior but as a man terrified of losing what little he had left. I took a breath. You taught me to serve, sir, even when it hurts. His eyes met mine, steady, proud, broken. Then he nodded once slowly. Understood, Major. Dismissed. That night, the camp was eerily quiet. No orders, no engines, just the distant hum of cicadas and the ocean's breath. I sat outside my tent staring at the moonlight dancing across the water, and for the first time in years, I prayed not for victory, but for peace. He joined me a few minutes later, silent, holding 2 cups of coffee again. He handed me one and said, "You remind me too much of her. Stubborn, brave, impossible to command." I smiled faintly. Guess it runs in the family. He chuckled under his breath, then sighed. Claire, if I'd known if she'd told me things might have been different. Maybe, I said. But then maybe I wouldn't be who I am, and maybe you wouldn't respect me if I wasn't. He nodded slowly, eyes glinting under the lamplight. Your mother would be proud. That simple sentence broke something inside me. The walls I'd built, the resentment I'd carried, all of it cracked under the weight of those 5 words. 2 days later, we completed the mission. Civilians were safe roads, cleared supplies restored. Before we redeployed, the general gathered the team for a short debrief. He spoke about courage, discipline, and the honor of service. But when his gaze met mine, his voice wavered. There are moments, he said, when duty gives us family we never expected, and sometimes it gives us a second chance to do what's right. The men applauded. They thought it was just another speech, but I knew what it meant. As the sun rose the next morning, I stood alone by the shore. The sky was pink soft, almost forgiving. I rolled up my sleeve, tracing the faint scar where my uniform's cuff ended. I thought about the tattoo, the red rose, the infinity symbol, the promise my mother had made, and the one he had kept without even realizing it. For the first time since that night in Arlington, I felt calm. The anger didn't vanish, but it settled like waves finally accepting the shape of the shore. When the general walked past to board the transport, I saluted. He returned it crisp and precise, but there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Peace. He said quietly, "Semper Fidelis, Major." "Always faithful, sir," I replied. As the helicopter lifted, I knew something had shifted between us. We weren't father and daughter in the traditional sense, but we were bound by something stronger, service love, and the ghosts we'd both learned to live with. That night I wrote in my mother's old journal. Today I almost drowned, but I also learned how to breathe again. 2 weeks later I was back in Virginia, but I didn't feel like I'd come home. My body was in Quantico, yet my mind was still knee-deep in Florida. Floodwater, voices, faces, and the sound of rotors haunting every dream. I tried to lose myself in the routines, the 0500 runs, the reports, the endless meetings. But the moment I let silence creep in, I heard him again. "Semper Fidelis, Major." 3 days after our return, I got the call. General Marcus Hale had collapsed in his office at the Pentagon, massive stroke. He never regained consciousness. By the time I reached Walter Reed Hospital, it was over. The world didn't stop. The flags didn't weep. They simply lowered themselves to half-mast as they do for men of rank. But for me, it felt like something deeper had fallen, a wall I'd spent my whole life pushing against. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery. The morning air was cool, dignified, heavy with tradition. Rows of white headstones gleamed like silent witnesses. Every step of the ceremony followed Marine precision rifle volleys, folded flags, the haunting notes of taps. I stood at the edge of the crowd, hands behind my back, eyes fixed on the casket draped in red, white, and blue. It was strange to mourn a man I'd only just begun to know, but grief doesn't wait for permission. It arrives like an order. After the salute, an aide approached me. He handed me a small brown envelope. "General Hale asked that this be delivered to you, Major Dawson, personally." My throat tightened. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate, and slightly slanted his. The seal was unbroken. I didn't open it right away. For 3 days it sat untouched on my kitchen table. Every time I walked by, I'd glance at it like it might explode if I tore it open too soon. But on the third night, I poured a glass of wine, turned off every light except one, and finally broke the seal. Inside were two things: a folded letter and a pressed rose petal, the same color as the one in my mother's locket. I unfolded the paper. The first line hit like a punch. My dearest Claire. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. There are things a man spends his life trying to put into words and then realizes too late that silence has already said them. But I need you to know what silence never did. I loved your mother. Not briefly, not foolishly, completely. She was the part of my life that wasn't bound by rank or politics. Losing her was the price I paid for ambition, and I've regretted it every day since. I didn't know about you, but when I found out, I watched your career from afar. I read your commendations, your reports, even the local articles about your rescue work. You became everything your mother was: brave, compassionate, relentless. You carry both our blood but all of her heart. The tattoo wasn't decoration. It was a promise we made to each other the night before I deployed. Love without end, duty without shame. She said love could be infinite if we let honor guide it. I failed that once. Don't let me fail it twice. If you ever wonder whether I was proud of you, know this: I have been saluting you in silence for years. Every time your name appeared in a report, every medal, every quiet act of mercy. You were the best part of me even when I didn't deserve you. Semper Fidelis always, not just to the core but to you. Marcus Hale. I sat there reading the words over and over until they blurred through tears. I had spent my whole life defining him as the absence in every photograph, every story my mother never told. Now his words filled those empty spaces like light through old cracks. Still, forgiveness doesn't arrive with ink. It comes slowly like the tide. And as I folded the letter back, I realized it wasn't about forgiving him. It was about understanding the weight of love carried in silence. The next morning I went to Arlington again. The grass was still damp with dew and the air smelled faintly of rain. I stood at his grave, the flag marker bright against the gray stone. Kneeling down, I took the pressed rose petal from the envelope and laid it beside his name. For a long time I just sat there. No words, no prayers, just the sound of wind brushing through the trees, whispering the things we never said. Then softly I spoke, "Rest easy, sir." And for the first time in my life I said it not as a Marine but as a daughter. That evening, back at my apartment, I placed the letter beside my mother's photograph. Two halves of the same story finally together. When I turned off the light, the last thing I saw was that single sentence shining in my mind. You were the best part of me. And somehow it was enough. A month after the funeral, I transferred back to Camp Lejeune. Different base, same uniform. But everything felt changed, like the world had shifted half an inch while no one was looking. My colleagues greeted me with the usual jokes, coffee and paperwork, but I wasn't the same officer who'd left for Florida. Something inside had settled. Not peace exactly, but a kind of quiet understanding. At night after drills, I'd walk along the dunes near the water. That's where my mother used to take me as a child. She'd point to the horizon and say, "Out there, the sky and the sea are the same color." That's where forgiveness lives. I never understood it then. But now I did. One evening I sat on the beach just before sunset the same way she used to. I had both of their dog tags in my hand, hers old and worn, his polished and bright. I traced the engraved names with my thumb: Evelyn G. Dawson, Marcus R. Hale. 2 lives, 2 choices, 1 legacy. I rolled up my sleeve. The skin on my wrist still bore the faint tan line where my watch had been for years. It felt bare, unfamiliar, but maybe that's what new beginnings look like. A week later, I walked into a small tattoo shop in Wilmington. The artist was a retired Navy corpsman with weathered hands and kind eyes. When I showed him the drawing, he smiled. "A rose with thorns making the infinity loop," he said. "That's beautiful. What's the story?" I paused. For once I didn't feel the need to hide it. "It's about love," I said, "and duty, and how sometimes they're the same thing." He nodded silently and got to work. The needle's hum filled the room as the ink etched into my skin, soft, rhythmic, almost soothing. When it was done, I stared at my wrist. A small red rose, its thorns forming an infinity symbol. The same one they had shared. But this time, it was mine. A few days later, I was invited to speak at the local Marine Corps Family Foundation dinner. It was one of those gatherings filled with old uniforms, folded flags, and stories that start with "back in my day." They asked me to talk about courage. I almost declined. But that night, standing behind the microphone, looking at the faces of veterans and their families, men and women who'd lost as much as they'd given, I felt something shift inside me. My mother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, I began. It's doing what's right even when it costs you something. And my commanding officer, General Hale, taught me that duty can last longer than life itself. The room went silent. No applause, just listening. I smiled faintly. Sometimes, I continued, we carry our pain like a medal. We polish it, we protect it. But the truth is, pain is just love that hasn't found its way home yet. A few people nodded. One older man wiped his eyes. I ended simply. So, if there's someone you haven't forgiven yet, someone you still think about when the house is quiet, maybe tonight's the night you let go. Because forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom. When I stepped down, a woman in her 70s grabbed my hand. "Major," she said, voice trembling, "you just told my story too." Later that night, I drove to the coast. The moon hung low gold on the water and the tide whispered like it had secrets to tell. I took the 2 sets of dog tags from my pocket. For a moment, I held them both close to my chest. "Mom," I said softly, "you were right. The truth did salute me." Then I walked to the edge of the surf, knelt down, and set the tags side by side in the wet sand. A wave rolled in and covered them gently. When it receded, the metal caught the moonlight shining together finally. I stayed there for a long time. The wind carried the sound of waves and distant laughter from a nearby pier. Somewhere I thought I heard both their voices, hers warm and kind, his steady and proud. Not ghosts, not memories, just love infinite as the tide. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I whispered "Semper Fidelis." And this time it wasn't just a motto, it was a prayer. Call to action, soft, heartfelt close. If you've ever carried a story that still hurts, let it breathe tonight. Share it, forgive someone, or maybe forgive yourself. Because sometimes the bravest thing a soldier or a daughter can do is lay down her armor. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, leave a comment, share where you're watching from. And remember, honor isn't about revenge. It's about what survives after the pain fades.